US President Donald Trump announced plans to double tariffs on foreign steel imports from 25 to 50%, a move aimed at bolstering the domestic steel industry. The increase set to take effect this week could lead to higher prices for various goods that use steel. The new tariffs will apply to imports from countries including Australia, Canada and Brazil, which previously enjoyed duty-free access. Critics, including Australian government officials, argue that these tariffs are unjustified and could harm consumers as well as global trade. Chris Berg is a professor of economics at RMIT University. He joins me now from Melbourne. Great to see you. Talk to us about the impact that the tariff hike will have on US manufacturers and consumers first.
Thanks for having me. It's going to have quite a significant impact. A hike of steel tariffs to 50% is really going to affect the US manufacturing industry, particularly because steel is such an important intermediate good. The United States is one of the largest, if not the largest, arms developer and arms producer in the world. It's a clear priority for the Trump administration to grow that capability, to grow manufacturing capability across the economy more generally. And the decision to tax basic imports into that manufacturing sector is going to be very harmful to the administration's stated goal.
It feels kind of cheeky, doesn't it? On the one hand, the Defence Secretary is travelling to Singapore, telling countries that they need to spend more on munitions and on arms that we generally buy from the United States, but then also putting a tariff on the steel that we're creating and sending to them to make the products we're buying back off them.
Yeah, look, I think they're going to learn to regret these decisions. I'm not opposed to Australia spending much more on its defence. I think that's important and necessary. And I don't mind the United States insisting that we do, or asking that we do. But the idea that they are simultaneously hobbling their own manufacturing industry while pretending to defend it, that we may, of course, have to pay in higher prices, or we may have to look elsewhere for other products outside the United States, I think is very counterproductive to the United States' stated aims. And I think the Trump administration needs to decide what it wants to do. Does it want to pump up a domestic steel industry, or does it want to be the arms producer for the world, the great manufacturing powerhouse that the Trump administration obviously would like?
All right, let's have a listen to President Trump speaking over the weekend.
We are going to be imposing a 25% increase. We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States of America, which will even further secure the steel industry in the United States. Nobody's going to get around that. So we're bringing it up from 25%. We're doubling it to 50%.
All right, doubling it to 50%. The question there, and you can see from the people behind, it's like a campaign launch for an election. Is this more about politics than economics?
I think it's absolutely much more about politics. I think the context of this is the purchase of US steel by a Japanese company, Nippon Steel, that was first rejected by the Biden administration, has now been approved by the Trump administration just the other day. And I think the announcement of the steel tariffs is a sort of sweetener to some in the union movement around the steel industry to say, well, yes, we are selling this significant company to a Japanese company, but at the same time, we are putting in these protections to the steel industry and against steel importers. Now, I understand that's potentially a very compelling political message, but as I say, it's incredibly counterproductive because it will materially harm all the inputs, all the manufacturing goals of the Trump administration if it continues to do so.
Let's talk about US allies like Australia. How are they likely to respond? We've seen obviously a lot of push from Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, to even just try and get on the phone with President Trump. It felt like President Trump was kind of making a joke about that a few weeks ago, and he says, yes, he keeps trying to call. The Australians keep trying to call. But Australia's really been singled out by US authorities over steel and over beef. How does Australia respond to this without hurting the economy?
So thus far, the Albanese response has actually been pretty strong. We have the government has publicly stated or suggested to journalists that it would consider taking action in the World Trade Organization. Now, how effective that action would be at changing the Trump administration's mind, who knows? But it's been quite clear that this is a counterproductive measure from the United States perspective. Now, the harm that this would do to the Australian economy isn't that clear. I think it's embarrassing from the Albanese government's perspective because they've just done a very significant bailout of the Whyalla Steelworks in South Australia. But for the most part, the impact of the 25% steel tariff has not been substantial, in part because the Australian firms that are involved in the steel industry, well, they actually have really significant US-based operations. I don't think this is great for the Australian economy, but it's not catastrophic, and I think the Albanese government will be weighing very carefully what the trade-offs between defending Australian industry and maintaining the alliance.
It feels like it's a death of the free market, doesn't it? All of this government intervention feels like socialist policy as opposed to the concept of free markets to which the Republicans have been famous for. And on top of that, the European Union, famous for pushing against free markets, they're now pushing against this and warning about a broader trade war. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's absolutely right. Even the Chinese government has been making statements about protecting the international order. Now, I think everybody's talking out both sides of their mouths, but it's absolutely the case, as you point out, that the Republican Party in the United States has turned very heavily against the founding principles of free markets that have driven that party for at least the last half century. I think that is very much to the United States' disadvantage. You have now both of the major parties in the United States are pro-tariffs, pro-regulation on disfavored industries. I think it's actually quite catastrophic for American living standards, and I hope that the rest of the world is able to maintain open markets, free trade as much as possible, even as the world's biggest economy is going the other direction.
We don't have much time, but do you think that is possible? Do you think that the world will now cave in to a tariff world?
I don't think that Australia will. I've been very pleasantly surprised by the solidness of the Australian government. The Albanese government has been excellent on this. We are a small, open economy. Free trade works very, very well for us, and it will continue to do so. And I think both sides of politics recognise that.
Chris Berg from RMIT in Melbourne, thanks so much for dropping by. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.